The sort of work that I do, I suppose, could be termed realism. I get lumped in with hyper-realist painters. I guess my propensity to kind of put lots and lots of detail into a painting. However, a lot of the hyper-realist painters tend to be photorealists, and they tend to kind of take a photograph and reproduce the photograph. Whereas a lot of the time I'm kind of interpreting the photograph, I'm taking the photograph, I'm enhancing the colour, I'm taking things out that I don't think are necessary, I'm putting things in perhaps that I think are necessary and I'm not seeing the information or the detail. Plus a lot of the time I get the information from multiple images. It's not just one image, and it may well be from spending some time in front of the actual subject, whatever that might be. So that I have not just a photographic image of one particular spot, but I kind of know what's above, underneath, what's around the sides, what's going on, what the air temperature was like, where the sun was. All that sort of stuff is relevant to kind of give you a bit of background knowledge into what you're doing when you're painting. Hyperrealist, photorealist, definitely not photorealist. Hyperrealist, because I put in a lot of detailing, perhaps, but definitely not photorealist. However, I do use photographs as a source of reference as well as objects in a studio, or going out and doing some plein air. Not entirely comfortable doing plein air because I have such a limited amount of time, and that's the biggest thing for me, is time, because I'm spending a lot of time in my paintings and I'm working a long time on the pieces, and that's the only way I can add the detail. Very tricky when you've only got 2 or 3 hours before the sun moves. It is about observation. It really is about me spending a little bit of time taking care of the information. As I say before, when I'm working, I'll maybe focus on a particular colour, and so I'll start to see that colour everywhere. If I focus on detail, I start to see that detail everywhere. The way I actually work is I start off by thinking in general terms. So I start off with very simple shapes, looking at it almost from a distance, not even taking care of the surface texture or anything like that, just what's going on in the basic shapes, what is the makeup of the image, what's the abstract idea or the concept behind that image that you're making, and from that I'll then break down each section. So what's happening in this part of the section, very simple, but actually what's going on there, so I kind of break it down into sort of slightly smaller sections, and then what's within each section. And I'll break it down, going from the general to the specific, and going from very broad sort of brushstrokes, as it were, right down to kind of small brushstrokes, very sort of detailed. So the detail is kind of built on a structure of big broad ideas and big broad brushstrokes, and bringing it right down into smaller, finer brushstrokes and smaller detail. So going from that simple to something a lot more complex. But it all starts off simple. The grid is squaring up. And squaring up, I mean, Michelangelo used squaring up. You're basically they would do it from a cartoon, which is basically a cartoon is a drawing, and they would transfer it onto a wall or another painting or whatever surface, and they would basically take a small drawing and they would grid it up, and then they would do larger grids, as long as it's in proportion, bigger grid, and basically whatever's in this little grid here goes in this bigger grid here. And so you're basically transferring the image, and what's really good about that is it gives you the essence of the image, the composition. You'll make sure that everything's more or less in the right place. You still have to draw it. You still have to kind of look very carefully as to where things are going. It's different to doing a tracing. If you do a tracing, you tend to find that the image is flattened. You end up putting too much information because you decide, well, if I'm putting in all the lines, I may as well put on the shadows, and then I'll put in all the textures, and I'll put in everything, and then it becomes an exercise of colouring in, which is not really what it's about. You kind of want to be able to build up that texture with, using different sorts of techniques and things. So I shy away from doing that, and I tell my students to kind of shy away from doing that. The gridding up is the best way of transferring one image to another, to scale it up and to do it in a way that is accurate. I like painting anything that's old, and I like painting anything that's old because it has a lot of texture. And I like textures, I like surfaces, I love colour. Sometimes a lot of textural things are, like old doors and things. They can actually be really interesting texture-wise, but they can be slightly dull because the colours are maybe all light-coloured wood or whatever. It might be the sun's bleached it, so there's absolutely nothing left. So it's not just having texture, it has to have a little bit of colour. So rust can be quite interesting because rust's got a lot of strong colour in it. And it's not always the same. So it's not always a yellowy orange colour. It could be purples, it could be greens, it could be light purples, lavender colours. Anything that I do has to have really interesting colours, really interesting sort of shapes. Interesting subject would be great, and interesting textures. And I will paint anything. It's not just doors and locks and things like that. I will paint people. I will paint people with these type of things around them, broken walls or whatever. As long as the subject is interesting enough, I can kind of work with it. I see something in there that I think is worthwhile pursuing. And it could be anything. It really could be anything. I use a lot of stippling, and I use a lot of dry brushing and splattering, quite a lot of splattering. I'll use wet on wet when I'm wanting a little bit smoother kind of blending going on, but wet on dry when I want to build up these textures. So there's a lot of layering going on, so building up the layers one on top of the other. Tend to use fairly pure colours, not an awful lot of mixed colours. Tend to mix my blacks, but as often as I can, I try to kind of apply pure colour, but occasionally I'll maybe take a lavender and I'll stick it with a violet or something like that, just to take the transparent colour and give it a bit of body, is basically what I'm doing. I'm using dragging to create wood textures. I'm using sponges to help kind of blend, spraying, clean water, and then applying splattering on top of the clean water. Using some crayons, watercolor crayons that I've used. They're water soluble, so you can work on top of them and you can do all sorts of things with them. So they're really useful. But I try to kind of be disciplined and do a drawing before I start. So I go into the studio and I kind of look at things that maybe I've looked at what I did the day before, and then sort of assess what's needing done. I'll then have a look at some potential ideas for future paintings, and then I'll maybe even working on a painting, and I'm not quite sure about what I'm going to be doing next with the picture. So I use my drawing of the day, first drawing, as soon as I kind of go in, to kind of try and work through some ideas, or it might be just to work through a potential problem I have in a painting, try to solve that. So I think, drawing to me is the fundamental of all drawing, all painting, as it were. Even when you're painting with a paintbrush, you're still drawing with it. You're still not needing to be able to kind of manipulate the drawing. And for me, the best painters tend to be really good at drawing. And that doesn't mean, kind of like doing a traced image and putting that down, which is a kind of shortcut way of getting around the drawing. But you need to be able to have drawing skills in order to understand what you're painting. The people who are really good at painting tend to be really good at drawing. And for me, it's a fundamental thing. I spent years at art school learning how to draw, and I keep that going by making sure I made a challenge to myself when I left art school, even when I was working full-time in a job in a museum when I was younger, is that every single day I would paint and every single day I would draw, because I knew if I stopped that I would start to kind of lose that skill. And it'd taken me like 24 years to learn that skill, and then I didn't want to lose it. So every single day I would make sure that I drew.